great to see you all this morning. Thank you so much for coming on what is a bit of a cloudy day. I have to say I've met a lot of new first-time folks this morning when I was outside greeting, and it's just wonderful to see so many new folks giving us a try. What's the term? Kicking the tires, taking us out for a test drive. So thank you so much for joining us. And just to reiterate what Angela announced earlier, if you are new to the congregation, if this is your first time, that you are most invited to join us at 12:15 out on the patio, just right over there, for a 30-minute newcomer circle. It's very informal and relaxed. You don't have to have signed up. So I hope to see some of you there. That would be really, really wonderful. So, and Angela, thanks as always for your great help and support today. And I really enjoyed hearing you share Lucille Longview's reading a few minutes ago. I want to just let you all know that today's sermon and service is the first of a two-part series. Our monthly theme is heritage, and I am using that as an invitation, I guess, to talk a little bit about the UU past, the journey that we're on, and where we are today, and where I think we're going in the future. So the conversation, next Sunday service will complete the two-part series, and then after the service, we'll have a conversation in here, which all who are here are invited, and those of you on Zoom, I won't be asking Rachel. She's got this whole wedding thing. I don't know what that's all about, but I think Sean will be up there next Sunday, and we'll keep the Zoom going, and we'll have a dual platform conversation about something in particular that we really haven't had a chance to talk much about yet, which is a proposed revision to Article 2 of our denomination's bylaws. And that particular article contains the principles and purposes of the Unitarian Universalist Association, including our current 7 UU principles. And the proposal would, if it's adopted, would replace those principles with new language that centers core values like justice, generosity, pluralism, and love. Now, I'll say more about the proposed revision next Sunday, and then we'll talk about it after the service. I have to say that I think that the proposed revision of Article 2 marks a transformational moment in the history of Unitarian Universalism, a moment that I believe, and this is my opinion, will help our religious tradition become more inclusive, more welcoming, more just, and more loving. Now today, I want to put that discussion and that conversation in some context by looking back at what I see as the last really major significant shift in our faith tradition, which began about 50 years ago and led to the adoption of the current 7 UU principles, and also inspired much of the transformation in Unitarian Universalism over the last 5 or 6 decades. Transformation which, in my view, has enriched Unitarian Universalism so very much and helped us become a religion of head and heart, individual freedom, and beloved community. Now, the story of this transformation from 50 years ago begins with the courage and the vision of a fairly small group of Unitarian Universalist women. And let me tell you a little bit about one of those women. Her name, as you heard earlier, was Lucille Shook Longview. And I think it's fair to say that Lucille Longview, I think, may be the most important and influential person in the history of our faith tradition that very few Unitarian Universalists have ever heard of. And there's a picture. That's Lucille a number of years after all that resolution was adopted, and there she is. She's the one on the right, and sorry it's a little blurry, with some of the other really, really, really important Unitarian Universalist women who led that movement in the 1970s and whose legacy in Unitarian Universalism lives on to this very day. Now, throughout Lucille's life, she was active as a Unitarian Universalist and in a variety of social justice and community endeavors. She was, for example, passionately concerned about the rights and treatment of the elderly and was an early member of the Gray Panthers. Lucille was also a committed environmentalist and worked tirelessly to raise awareness about the need for humankind to live in harmony with, rather than in opposition to, the planet. Lucille, of course, was a feminist and outspoken advocate for women's rights, who dedicated much of her life to building a future of inclusion and justice for women everywhere, including and especially in Unitarian Universalism. And by the way, it was Lucille's passion for a better future that led her to add the word Longview to her last name. For years, she was Lucille, I don't remember what her pre-married name was. She was Lucille Shook, and then she added Longview because she was dedicating her life to building a future, a better future, not only in the short term, but in the long term. Now, in the mid-1970s, Lucille served as a UU delegate to the UN International Women's Year Conference, while listening to one story after another chronicling the oppression and patriarchy that women experienced across the world. Lucille came to the conclusion that religion was a huge part of the problem. I'm guessing she probably figured that out before that conference. And the reason she believed this was because religion provided much of the foundation and justification for the subordination and oppression of women. And Lucille felt very strongly that that observation most assuredly also applied to Unitarian Universalism. Now, at first glance, describing us, UU, as patriarchal and oppressive may sound a little odd, maybe even kind of harsh. I mean, after all, Unitarians and Universalists played important roles in the struggle to guarantee women the right to vote, and both traditions were also early supporters of the movement for birth control. Unitarians and Universalists counted as members many important and influential women in American history, and it was the Universalist Church of America that ordained Reverend Olympia Brown into the ministry in 1860, making her the first woman in the United States to ever be ordained into the ministry by a denomination. That's a pretty good record. But in spite of all these accomplishments, for much of its history, Unitarian Universalism was guided by the assumptions of patriarchy and, well, how do I say it? Male dominance and male superiority. For example, while women almost always made up the majority of our congregations and comprised most of our church volunteers, some things never change, they were frequently kept out of top leadership positions. Even after the merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists in 1861, UU ministry was dominated by men, and as late as 1980, and I found this statistic, 1980, women only comprised about 5% of Unitarian Universalist ministers. If a woman wanted to be a religious professional, her primary avenue was to become a religious educator, but not also an ordained minister. And lay leadership often followed much the same pattern. Many congregations' governing boards tended to be male-dominated, and women did not generally begin serving as congregational presidents until the 1970s or even later. And remember, the first woman ever elected to serve as president of our association was elected just 7 years ago. And then, of course, there was the problem, as you heard earlier, of religious language. In spite of Unitarian Universalism's long history of religious tolerance and openness, the use of patriarchal language was commonplace. A few moments ago, Angela read an excerpt from that reflection about the Women in Religion resolution, in which she described how exclusive our language and principles had been. Those principles, the ones that were originally adopted in 1961, and we don't ever even talk about those anymore, they spoke of the dignity of man. They stressed the ideal of universal brotherhood. They celebrated a religious heritage centered on love of God and man, and called on us to encourage cooperation with men of goodwill in every land. But thanks to Lucille and her female colleagues, things began to shift and change in the 1970s. She wrote the draft resolution urging Unitarian Universalists to review their own beliefs and to reconsider teachings that, as she said, perpetuate attitudes that cause women everywhere to be overlooked and undervalued. A group of very dedicated women from her home congregation in Lexington, Massachusetts, circulated this draft resolution that Lucille wrote to thousands of Unitarian Universalists across the country and got it placed before the General Assembly in 1977. And it was there that this historic, what I think might be the most important resolution that's ever been put before Unitarian Universalists in our history, the Women in Religion resolution, was adopted. And I know it's not an exaggeration to say that this resolution forever changed Unitarian Universalism. And I don't think I'm saying anything controversial here to say unquestionably changed it for the better. For one thing, the demand for gender-inclusive language, that was the spark that led to a review of the 1961 principles and a fairly extended, very democratic conversation and process was developed, and we went through that. And that was what eventually led to the adoption of the current 7 UU principles. So our 7 principles were developed because a group of Unitarian Universalist women said enough. Enough with the sexism, the patriarchy, and the exclusion. But the movement for gender justice and equity embodied in that resolution had an impact far beyond just the 7 principles. For example, that same commitment to inclusive language led to the creation of our current hymnals, that gray hardcover that hopefully is in your pews, and then some years later, the teal hymnal as well. It was that desire to make our language more inclusive that led to the creation of those hymnals. Also, and perhaps more importantly, that resolution absolutely threw open the doors of the ministry to women in Unitarian Universalism. And since the late 1980s, right up to today, women have been entering UU ministry in wonderful, astonishingly wonderful numbers. In fact, while women made up just 5% of the ministers in 1980, they make up just over 60% of our ministers today. So I'm in the minority. Isn't that wonderful? So I know. By the way, 3 out of 4 of every aspiring UU minister is female identified. But for all of these extraordinary accomplishments, I think the most important contribution that Lucille Longview and the women's movement within Unitarian Universalism made was the way we UUs have come to understand ourselves, our spiritual journeys, our faith communities, and what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. You see, prior to the emergence and impact of the women's movement in the 1970s, I think it's fair to say that we UUs placed a pretty heavy emphasis on the importance of the individual and individual freedom. We assigned primary value to the use of reason and intellect and embraced a fairly top-down approach to ministry and leadership. but thanks in large part to the contributions of women over the last 50 years, we UUs have come to value and appreciate the importance of mind and spirit, the essential roles played by ritual and spiritual practice for our journeys of faith, and the need for a shared approach to ministry and leadership in our congregations and our denominations. And that brings me to the vision of religion and of UU bequeathed to us by Lucille and her wonderful colleagues. And I think what they taught us is that this faith we call Unitarian Universalism must always be about widening the circle of love and inclusion. Unitarian Universalism must be about opening doors that have been closed and welcoming all souls to the table of love and community. Notice I didn't say brotherhood. And Unitarian Universalism must always be about building a world free from those barriers that divide us against them and that leave some to be marginalized and oppressed. We UUs can and must follow the path blazed by those brave women who journeyed boldly into the future and who pointed the way to a world in which all people and our planet are valued, appreciated, welcomed, and loved. And if there's one essential lesson I think we need to learn from those extraordinary contributions of UU women over the last 50 years, I think it is that Unitarian Universalism is at its best and reaches for, if I can say it, greatness when we are listening to the voices of those who have been marginalized in our faith and in our world, and who are challenging us to tear down walls of privilege and exclusion. We must always be asking, whose voices have been or are being ignored? What assumptions are we making? And what messages are we conveying that are keeping the doors of full inclusion and equality closed in our faith? Those are the questions Lucille Longview and UU women asked 50 years ago, and their insistence that Unitarian Universalism see itself honestly forever changed us and helped make Unitarian Universalism a more loving and inclusive religious tradition. So let me just conclude by saying, I hope you'll be here next Sunday, either in person or on Zoom, for part 2 of this series and for the conversation that follows. I'm going to share with you the story of another key transformational moment in Unitarian Universalism that happened around the same time as the women's movement got going in UU. But this moment didn't spark a change. It was one of the colossal missed opportunities in Unitarian Universalism, and one that we are just now, finally, at long last, reaching out and healing and doing something about. How's that for a teaser for next Sunday? And I'm just going to argue next Sunday that Unitarian Universalism, I think today, is on a journey to correct the missed opportunity and mistake we made, and that the proposed revision of our principles and purposes is part of an effort to correct that mistake and to build a deeper, more inclusive, and more just Unitarian Universalism. See you next Sunday.